Welcome back to Deep Dive Stoic. In today's deep dive, we're going to explore, the strategic art of Stoic silence. How what you don't say can actually be like your greatest power.
Ooh, I like that. The power of the unspoken word.
Exactly. And you know what's cool about this is that you, the listeners, you've actually sent in some sources, and those sources highlight 10 specific subjects where we as modern Stoics really need to watch our words.
10. Wow. Okay, so a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, a lot to unpack. It's like a roadmap to like when to hold your tongue, for maximum impact, but also for your own inner peace, right?
Makes sense. Silence is a shield in this really noisy world.
So yeah, let's dive right in. Our mission today is to go through these 10 subjects and really see why silence can be such a powerful tool in each area. And the first one's kind of interesting, the quiet goals that motivate you inside.
Okay, so like those dreams we all have, right?
Yeah.
Those personal ambitions.
Yeah, exactly. Those things that maybe haven't even fully formed yet, like they're just starting to like simmer in your mind. Why do you think the Stoics were so adamant about keeping those close to the vest for a while?
Well, one of the sources called these like personal embers. And I thought that was so beautiful. It really captures that delicate nature, of those early stages of motivation. Like, think about it. If you share something that's deeply personal and still kind of fragile, instantly it's like you're opening it up to external evaluation.
Yeah, and even if people have good intentions, even just their questions, their feedback, it can almost like unintentionally kind of like blow out that flame a little bit,
Right, and it can kind of make you doubt yourself.
Mm-hmm.
The source even mentioned how these dreams can kind of wither under other people's like scrutiny or misunderstanding.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder, like, when we do that, when we share those early dreams, is it because we're like genuinely excited, or are we maybe subconsciously looking for validation before we even truly believe in it ourselves,
That's a good point. And I think that ties in really well with that whole emphasis on internal validation in Stoicism.
Right.
Like if our sense of self-worth or even just believing in our goals, if that becomes dependent on other people's approval, then we're kind of setting ourselves up for a shaky foundation.
Yeah, very shaky. But nurturing those aspirations privately, it's almost like you're allowing them to build strength from within. And then when you do eventually choose to share them, it's not for validations because they've already taken root in your own heart.
It's like a plant, right? You give the roots time to grow before you expect it to flourish.
That's a great analogy. It makes me think of someone like Socrates. I mean, his influence was huge, right? But it wasn't because he was out there constantly promoting himself. It was through his actions and like his students sharing his ideas later on. There's a certain mystique in that delayed revelation, isn't there?
Totally. And it adds a layer of depth.
Yeah.
And it makes the impact even stronger when it finally does come out, you know?
Yeah, and that reminds me of how one of the sources put it. The most powerful forces are those that develop quietly beneath the surface. They even use that great analogy of fine whiskey aging, like that maturation process, that private space allows for something way more potent and refined. It's not rushed.
Okay, so we've talked about those quiet goals, those inner dreams, but now let's switch gears a little bit. Our second subject, it's a bit more delicate. It's our deficiencies, our points of weakness.
Ooh, yeah. Those things that we'd maybe rather not broadcast to the world. We all have them, right? Those areas where we feel less than perfect. What do the Stoics say about how we handle and especially how we communicate those vulnerabilities?
Well, it's not about denying that we have those weaknesses. In fact, the sources really stress the importance of acknowledging them to ourselves. Like that's crucial for self-awareness and for growth, right? But what they caution against is carelessly revealing them to the world.
So it's not about pretending to be flawless. It's about being really choosy about who we share those vulnerabilities with and when we do it, right?
Exactly. And then one of the texts used a really powerful phrase, I thought. It warned against exposing our vulnerabilities to the untempered forge of public opinion. Like, ouch.
Yeah, that's a pretty vivid image. And the truth is, not everyone's going to respond to our vulnerabilities with like understanding and empathy.
Right. And even with the best intentions, someone might misinterpret what we're saying. They might seize upon a weakness and use it against us.
Or even if they don't do that, it might just completely color their perception of us, Like suddenly that one vulnerability becomes the defining characteristic that they see.
Exactly. While being open about our struggles can build intimacy in like safe and trusted relationships, indiscriminate sharing can backfire.
It can really mess with our own self-perception too, don't you think?
Totally. So how do we navigate this then?
Well, the concept of handling vulnerabilities with stoic grace, I think that's super powerful. It suggests a kind of quiet strength in admitting to our shortcomings, but then also actively working through them, and not for show, but for ourselves.
Yeah, it's about that internal process. And speaking of internal processes, one source mentioned this idea that in solitude, weaknesses can actually become strengths. Like, wow, that's a powerful motivator for introspection.
Totally. So it's not about wallowing in self-pity, but about using that private space to really understand those vulnerabilities. Like, where do they come from? How can we learn from them? And even how can we turn them into something positive?
It's like alchemy almost.
Yeah, turning lead into gold. And that's where those historical examples come in, right? Like Abraham Lincoln and Julius Caesar.
Yeah.
One source highlighted how Lincoln's private struggles, his battles with despair, they actually honed his empathy and his ability to connect with people. But then on the flip side, Caesar, his unaddressed vulnerabilities, they led to his downfall.
Those are such powerful reminders of how we choose to deal with our weaknesses, whether we do it publicly or privately, can really have a huge impact on the course of our lives.
Yeah. So it seems like embracing our vulnerabilities privately isn't about shame or hiding. It's about creating that safe space for understanding and growth.
Exactly. And I think that's what one of the sources was getting at with the idea that not every chapter of our inner lives needs to be an open book.
There's a certain strength and mystique in what remains unsaid. Those internal battles we face and overcome, they're kind of sacred.
Totally. And that actually leads us to our third subject, the quiet wars that we're all engaging in, those internal conflicts, those battles that we're constantly waging within ourselves.
And again, the Stoics really seem to advocate for keeping those battles largely private. Why is that?
Well, our hyper-connected world makes it so easy to share everything, right? But when it comes to these internal struggles, one source emphasized the importance of discernment, like really being thoughtful about when and with whom we share those battles.
And it said something really powerful, too, about there being a sacredness in silent struggle. Not every fight needs an audience.
And I think sometimes we can almost get addicted to that validation and support we get from others. Like, we feel like we need to air every difficulty, every little bit of turmoil that we're going through.
Yeah, it's like broadcasting every inner struggle for likes and comments.
Right, and it can be tough to resist that, you know. But the Stoic perspective seems to advocate for a more self-contained approach, at least with certain struggles.
It reminds me of Epictetus and how he talked about how it's not the external events themselves that distress us. It's our judgments and interpretations of them, right?
Yeah, that's so key. And a lot of those internal wars are really about wrestling with our own perceptions and reactions, trying to make sense of things. And that's such a personal process.
Yeah. And those battles, one text reminded us, they're actually the crucible of your strength. It's through those conflicts that we really forge resilience and inner strength.
I love that. The crucible of strength. So powerful. And the source is right, the tenacity and the resources we cultivate in facing those challenges, that's a journey we often take alone.
And sometimes the people around us, even if they want to, they just can't truly grasp the complexity of what we're going through internally, right?
It's like trying to explain a dream. Sometimes the essence gets lost in translation.
Exactly. So again, it's about being selective, being discerning about where and with whom we share those battles, recognizing that the most profound transformations often happen in the quiet space of our own minds.
And honoring the value of that space, right? For processing, for struggling, and ultimately for emerging stronger.
So we've talked about our quiet goals, our vulnerabilities, our inner battles. Now, subject number 4 takes us in a more positive direction. Our accomplishments, our fortunes, our successes.
Okay, so this one is interesting because our world is very much about shouting your accomplishments from the rooftops, right?
Yeah, we're constantly bombarded with messages about celebrating our wins, being loud and proud. But the Stoics seem to take a much more reserved approach to sharing successes. Why do you think that is?
Well, a few things come to mind. One source really emphasized that true, lasting confidence comes from an internal sense of accomplishment, not from seeking praise or applause from others. They even asked, why whisper when you could shout?
And the answer is that the Stoics understood the fleeting nature of external validation, right? Like today, people might cheer you on, but tomorrow they might be focused on something else entirely.
Exactly. It's about finding that deeper satisfaction in the accomplishment itself, in the effort, the growth, the journey you took to get there, not just in the recognition it might bring.
One text really stressed that sharing successes should be selective, and that their true weight is felt in the soul, not in the number of likes or comments you get.
Yeah. It's not about suppressing joy or pretending that you haven't achieved something. It's more about cultivating a joy that's rooted within yourself, independent of the whims of public opinion.
And I think that builds resilience too, doesn't it? Like, when you learn to find fulfillment from within, you're less likely to be thrown off balance by criticism or by people's changing opinions.
Absolutely. Quietly acknowledging our milestones builds a different kind of strength. It's almost like you're building up this inner fortress that can weather any storm.
And that reminds me of the myth of Icarus, flying too close to the sun. That story was often used as a warning against the dangers of craving too much external validation.
Yeah, that's a great example. The source said, embrace your victories, relish them, but let the depth of your pride be a personal affair. Like, let that satisfaction sink in before you feel the need to announce it to the world.
And when you do share, be intentional about it. Choose people who genuinely care about you and your journey, not just those who are looking for a spectacle.
Exactly. And that leads us to subject number 5. Your upcoming objectives, your future plans. What do the Stoics say about sharing those?
It seems like they were pretty cautious about revealing too much too soon. But why? Like, shouldn't we be excited to share our goals and get people on board?
Well, think of it this way. One source said that revealing your plans prematurely is kind of like exposing them to the evil eye, that idea that envy and negativity can almost like jinx your efforts.
Yeah, it's almost as if by putting it out there before it's fully formed, we're inviting all these unsolicited opinions and doubts, and it can really dilute our own confidence.
And that's not even mentioning like the pressure. Suddenly you're performing for an audience instead of just pursuing your own vision.
Makes sense. And there's that strategy element too, right? Like, if you're playing a game of chess, you wouldn't announce all your moves to your opponent ahead of time.
Exactly. One text said, revealing your intended moves too early allows others to counteract them. Whether it's actual competitors or just the circumstances of life, silence can be a powerful shield for your aspirations.
It's all about timing. One source put it beautifully, there's a time for planting and a time for harvesting. And that planting stage, that nurturing stage, it often thrives in the quiet darkness, away from prying eyes.
Exactly. Silence allows those plans to develop organically, at their own pace. It creates a fertile space for potential, free from outside pressures and expectations.
And speaking of keeping things under wraps, the example of Howard Hughes was really fascinating, wasn't it? He was notoriously secretive about his projects.
Yeah, but it also allowed him to achieve some pretty remarkable things. Like, he didn't have to deal with constant scrutiny and interference. He could really just focus on his own vision.
Which brings us to a key takeaway, I think. Stoicism isn't about being secretive for the sake of being secretive, right? It's about choosing carefully when and how you reveal information, especially when it comes to your ambitions and your plans.
It's about creating that buffer zone between your dreams and the constant noise of the world.
All right, so let's tackle subject number 6. Those pesky whispers of self-doubt that creep into the private chambers of our minds, those am I capable? Or what if I fail? Thoughts?
Yes, those familiar foes.
Exactly. So what's the Stoic approach to handling those, and even more importantly, to sharing them?
Well, it's interesting. One source actually presented a pretty radical perspective. It suggested that those whispers of doubt could actually be silent allies in disguise.
Allies? How so?
Well, they're pushing us towards deeper self-awareness. Like, instead of trying to ignore those doubts, we should maybe be listening to them, asking ourselves, what are they trying to tell me? What potential pitfalls are they highlighting?
That's so interesting. So not just trying to silence those voices, but really tuning into their message.
Exactly. One source even asked, why do we feel the urge to vocalize those uncertainties in the first place? Like, is it really helpful? Or are we just looking for reassurance? And the Stoic answer seems to be that silence in the face of doubt can actually be a powerful and proactive response.
So it's not about denying the doubt, but about engaging with it internally, right? Like taking it to that quiet battleground of introspection, as one text put it.
Exactly. Not seeking external validation or reassurance right away, but really sitting with that discomfort and seeing what emerges.
Which, in a world that's all about instant sharing and broadcasting everything, that can be a really radical act.
Right. Turning inward instead of outward.
Sure.
Creating that space for solitude where we can face those doubts head on.
And one source even said that the truest form of bravery might be confronting those internal adversaries alone, allowing ourselves to be both the battlefield and the peacemaker within our own minds.
Wow. I love that. That really resonates.
Yeah.
And it reminds me that there's tremendous potential for growth in that private process of facing our doubts. Like, by working through those vulnerabilities in the quiet of our own hearts, we can actually emerge stronger and more resilient.
Not in spite of the doubt, but because of it.
Exactly. And it also brings us to subject number 7, individual development. That ongoing process of growth and self-improvement that we're all engaged in.
And again, it's interesting how the Stoics approach this, because our culture is all about self-improvement, but it often feels very outward focused. Like we're supposed to document every step of our journey, share our wins, our struggles, our insights.
And one source had this beautiful image of a sculptor meticulously working on marble. It said that personal growth is often this silent, intimate art form that happens away from the public eye.
Yeah, and it's those private victories, those lessons we learn and internalize that really shape who we are, not the external validation or applause.
Exactly. It's like Michelangelo slowly revealing David from the block of stone. Our own evolution is often a solitary revelation of our best and truest selves.
And I think Seneca's advice, keep learning how to live, really speaks to that, doesn't it? It's not about achieving some final state of perfection. It's about that continual internal process of growth and understanding.
It's about prioritizing that internal acknowledgement of progress. Not seeking external rewards or recognition. The real measure of our growth is how we perceive and how we improve ourselves within the quiet sanctuary of our own minds.
And in this age of oversharing, it's so easy to get caught up in documenting every step of our journey for others. But the Stoics invite us to really examine our motivations. Like, are we sharing for genuine connection, or are we just seeking validation?
Great point. And speaking of examining our motivations, it's fascinating to consider how Marcus Aurelius approached personal growth. He poured so much of his inner life into his private meditations.
And that actually leads us to a really interesting insight from one of the sources. It said that silently navigating our own path of growth often has a much deeper and more lasting impact than broadcasting every little step along the way.
Yeah, it's letting our actions, the tangible outcomes of our inner work, speak louder than any grand proclamations. It's about that quiet, steady evolution, not the flashy, attention-grabbing display.
So we've talked about dreams, vulnerabilities, battles, accomplishments, plans, and doubts. Now, subject number 8 takes us into the realm of complaints. Those individual grievances, those annoyances that we all experience from time to time.
Oh yeah, the things that make us want to vent and rant and let the world know how we've been wronged.
Exactly. But in a world where grievances can go viral in an instant, what's the Stoic perspective on expressing our dissatisfaction?
Well, the Stoics were all about mastering our emotions, right? And one source emphasized that sharing our grievances can actually make them feel more intense. It's like we're adding fuel to the fire of our own frustration.
So instead of broadcasting those complaints to the world, the Stoic approach is to sift through our disgruntlement quietly.
Exactly, to sit with that discomfort and really examine it. And that reminds me of Epictetus and his famous quote, "It's not things that upset us, but our judgment about things." Like, that's a game changer, right?
Totally. It's just the focus from the external source of irritation to our own internal response. It's a reminder that we always have a choice in how we react.
And one source suggested this really helpful way of looking at it. They said to imagine those irritations as mere shadows that lose their power when we shine the light of our own rational scrutiny on them.
I love that, like bringing those complaints out of the darkness and really examining them in the light of reason.
Exactly. And that helps us discern, right? Like, is this a battle worth fighting? Is this a complaint that genuinely requires action? Or is it just my ego talking? Or maybe my fear?
And sometimes it's just letting it go, embracing that image of the Stoic vessel's steady course, unswayed by the fleeting storms of irritation.
Right. And it's also worth considering, what do we actually achieve by broadcasting our grievances? Does it lead to constructive change? Or does it just perpetuate negativity and drama?
Good question. The Stoics seem to believe that it was far more effective to address discontent through thoughtful action, not through public venting and complaining.
And a great example of what not to do is the feud between Edison and Tesla. They let their grievances fester, and it turned into this bitter rivalry.
Yeah, and that ultimately didn't benefit either one of them. So the takeaway here seems to be to pause before we hit that share button, to confront those complaints internally first and to understand what's really driving them.
And then to respond with wisdom and with intention, not with knee-jerk reactions or emotional outbursts.
Okay, now subject number 9 takes us into the realm of emotions, and not just any emotions, but the calm rise and fall of your feelings.
Okay, so we're talking about those constant shifts in our emotional landscape, right? Like, how do we navigate that in a stoic way?
Exactly, and it's interesting because our society often encourages us to express every emotion as we feel it, to be authentic and raw and unfiltered, but the Stoics seem to offer a different perspective.
Well, one source used this beautiful analogy of a majestic oak tree enduring the changing seasons. It said that our emotions, like the cycles of nature, don't necessarily need to be constantly on display.
That's a great image. There's strength in silently acknowledging our feelings and allowing them to unfold at their own pace, not feeling like we need to immediately react or broadcast every emotional wave as it hits us.
And in this world that's so focused on instant expression and outward display, that stoic approach is almost like a breath of fresh air. It's an invitation to turn inward, to create space for introspection.
And Marcus Aurelius was a master of that, wasn't he? His personal meditations were full of his reflections on his own emotional experiences.
Yeah, his writings are such a great model for that kind of inner dialogue. And it's a reminder that we can learn so much from simply observing our own emotions without feeling the need to immediately share them with the world.
And one source said something really profound. It said that there's a deep wisdom in the quietude that follows an emotional storm. Like taking that time to sit with those feelings and allow them to settle before we react or share.
It's not about repression, it's about creating a more thoughtful relationship with those inner experiences.
So not every emotion needs to be a spectacle. Some are best left to roll back into our own inner world, like giving them the space to ebb and flow within the confines of our own minds.
It's like we're honoring their privacy.
Okay, so we've almost made it through all 10 subjects. The final one, subject number 10, is a bit of a paradox. The attraction of too much comfort.
Interesting, yeah, like our natural tendency towards ease and seeking pleasure.
Exactly. And, our world makes it so easy to indulge in comfort, right? But the Stoics seem to believe that there's a certain strength that comes from resisting that pull, from intentionally stepping outside of our comfort zones.
One source talked about seeking the heat of the forge rather than the mere warmth of the hearth. Like there's something about challenging ourselves, pushing those boundaries that really build character.
It's about recognizing the value and even the courage in those small acts of discomfort, like taking a cold shower, sticking to a disciplined routine, choosing a simpler meal.
And it can be so tempting to broadcast those little acts of self-denial, right? Like, look at me, I'm being so stoic.
Totally. But Stoicism seems to teach a different approach. It's about that quiet virtue of reticence, letting those actions speak for themselves, letting them reinforce your own inner fortitude without needing external approval.
Yeah. It's like those actions are primarily for you, a personal testament to your commitment to growth.
And one text pointed out that the most meaningful strides in our personal growth often happen in solitude, away from the noise and distractions. It's about embracing those quiet moments of pushing our limits.
And remembering the words of Marcus Aurelius, letting our actions be driven by the pursuit of progress, not by the desire for show or recognition.
And the example of Alexander the Great was so powerful, wasn't it? Like here he is, one of the most powerful rulers in history, and he chooses to live a simple, austere life.
Exactly. He could have indulged in all the comforts and luxuries that his position afforded him, but he intentionally chose a different path, a path of discipline and self-mastery.
And I think that's such a powerful reminder for us today, because our modern world is full of comforts that can easily lead to complacency.
And it's those little acts of resistance, those small victories over our own desire for ease, that really fortify us from within. They might go unnoticed by the world, but they make all the difference in our own hearts and minds.
Thank you all for being a part of this deep dive with us. If this episode helped you slow down and reflect, support Deep Dive Stoic. Like, subscribe, and pass it on. See you next time.